Welcome to Hit the Brakes, where we dive into the top stories, market trends, and ins and outs of the supply chain. No matter if you're tuning in from the cab of your truck, behind your desk, or on your daily commute, we're glad you're here and we're ready to serve you. Let's get this show on the road.
All right, welcome back to the Hit the Brakes podcast. I'm Brett Lankford, Director of Strategy at Fetch Freight. And also joining me today is a new voice on the podcast, Louis Baxley, Sales Manager at Fetch Freight.
Hey, good afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
Thanks for joining, Louis. We recently, Louis and I, we attended the ACT Research Market Vital Seminar in Columbus, Indiana. It was actually their 71st, so maybe pacing for a record in longevity in the seminar world. And it was at the home of ACT Research there in Columbus, and we're here today just excited to share some of our top takeaways with you. So why don't we get started?
Yeah, let's go ahead. I'll jump us off. So one of the things we wanted to talk about, one of the big takeaways we took was just why has the market been down for so long? And, you know, we got a lot of raw data that fed into the narrative that it was, you know, the COVID event, not only in the macro economic market as a whole, but in particular the freight market that we're talking about, it was unprecedented on the way up, and it's been unprecedented on the way down. So, you know, what were your takeaways on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, like one topic, and we've even talked about this, you know, thinking back to, you know, the webinar we did in Q4 with ACT Research, where they presented their forecast for this current year, for 2024. A lot of the conversation focused around operating authorities. So the net changes in motor carrier authorities, that's a big topic. It's one of the, there's not a lot of great proxies out there for what really is happening in the trucking market. And, you know, this is one that's, I think, an easy go-to statistic for many just to get a pulse check. And, you know, what have we seen over the last, you know, 12 months has been kind of like record levels of revocations, you know, and net negative changes in operating authorities. That would kind of allude to this very large collapse in capacity. But I think the one insight the Dean Grokey from DAT actually brought forward on the subject is that when you're looking at these changes and the net, you know, adds or reductions in capacity, and, you know, from an operating authority standpoint, it's only encompassing about 2 or 3% of the total trucking capacity. Yeah. Those new entrants and exits from an authority standpoint. So really, it's this very large percentage of the market that's getting tracked through that metric, but that's kind of the driver behind the fluctuations in the spot market, just that small change.
Yeah, it was crazy to hear, you know, out of the hundreds of thousands of, you know, authority issuances and revocations that happen on a yearly basis, it really only comes down to the 2 or 3% that actually make a material change, inflationary, deflationary in the for-hire spot market. So I thought that was interesting. Talk a little bit about this, one of the dynamics they had discussed with the, you know, owner-operator balance sheet strength and how that has slowed down the exit of capacity in the market.
So this actually, I thought, you know, again, Dean from DAT kind of presented this information on the first day of the seminar, and I think, you know, we know that there was a lot of money made during COVID. The rates were the highest ever experienced in our industry. This was also the highest level of profitability for carriers, brokers, really anybody participating on the carrier side. But when you talk about owner operators, and also this kind of encapsulates the small fleets like the five truck or less fleets, but generally speaking, the operating expenses for this type of capacity is about $1.80 a mile. With all of the balance sheet strength and all of the cash on hand that these owner operators and some of these smaller carriers had, a lot of them were able to pay down financing on their tractors and trailers, and also convert, you know, lease agreements into acquisitions. That reduction in financing cost every month equates to roughly about 50 cents per mile. So just to put this into perspective, those who paid down their financing are not operating at $1.80 a mile. That's inclusive of fuel. They're operating at $1.30 a mile. Mm-hmm. Those carriers still are able to make profits. Those at the $1.80 are facing, on the flip side, are facing generational unprofitability. with the revenue that's out there in the spot market today. So I think that was such an enlightening statistic just to see, and it makes sense, but just to have that context and just, I guess, the awareness of what the circumstances are for those owner operators, given the context of all the the financing costs and really that component and how many have been able to solve for that through the profits that they made during COVID, I think really does provide a lot of insights as to how are they still hanging on. This is a big reason why.
Yeah, one of the ways it was in a boiled down form described during I can't remember if it might have been Tim or Ian from Act Research that described it, this exit of capacity from the owner operator side in the market has been delayed for what you were just talking about with these costs. And the way it was described is kind of just think of it in terms of the landing strip or the runway has been extended, where they normally would have been out of the market by now. They're able to hold on a lot longer because of how much was made during the pandemic. I think maybe a better analogy would be maybe they've lengthened the exit ramp.
Yeah. I think that really is really hits it on the head. And the other thing that they mentioned is just the record investment by private fleets, and what they mean by that is shipper managed fleets. So these are assets that belong to the shippers, drivers employed by the shippers. And it's been at record levels.
Which
do you have anything to comment on that with just the private fleet subject? I thought that was one of the more interesting topics of the conference.
I thought it was pretty interesting, the fact that also private fleet activity has not amounted, in the last few cycles anyway, has not amounted to as much of a mover up or down in the market as it has been. And there's kind of a little bit of a head-scratching time to be expanding your private fleet in the freight market during a recession. So, what were your thoughts?
That's exactly. And I, had an interview with Tim DeNoyer at ACT, and that was basically what I said. Like, the calculus doesn't make sense. And just for those who are listening, throw out a couple facts and figures for you. There were some insights from the conference, but private fleets, on average, through research with combined research between DAT and ACT Research, these private fleets operate at roughly $4 a mile. Think about what we just talked about with these owner operators: $1.80, $1.30 a mile, $4 a mile of operating expenses for these private fleets. And then when you think about, well, is there revenue opportunities potentially offset that for them? Basically playing ball in the for-hire market to get backhauls. I'm sure they're working on their customer freight and their network freight outbound, but those backhauls coming back, there must be some kind of offset, right? That helps justify this decision. Well, the facts that were thrown at us during the seminar, I think, complicate this picture even more. That the average revenue gained in the spot market on these backhauls for private fleets is only at $1 a mile, one of the lowest revenue numbers of any segment of capacity. If you think about that, the highest operating costs, more than double what owner operators are experiencing. Meanwhile, the $1 a mile revenue is roughly half of what the owner operators are experiencing.
Spending $1 for 25 cents.
They are getting hit on both sides, on the expense side and on the revenue side, when compared to their for-hire peers and competition. So it's very unprofitable, and it's less efficient just on average than the for-hire market. I'm sure that there are a number of reasons why, from a strategy standpoint, that shippers have pursued this. And there's not a one size fits all. But I think when you compare just kind of standard point-to-point freight, non-specialized equipment, non-specialized circumstances, it is no question that it's not really a competitor, a true competitor of the for-hire fleet yet. In today's market, it has been serving as one in terms of just holding down that demand for hire carriers out there. It's effectively removed a lot of volume from the spot market, from either shippers being able to manage this business on their own through their private fleets, or even facing competition in the spot market for backhauls. So I think, in light of, I think, what has been some fairly resilient demand and, consumption in the U.S., this has helped essentially hold rates down.
Yeah,
just through this influx of capacity.
It was, yeah. I mean, in summation on that with the private fleet stuff was really fascinating because that's not traditionally been as big of a segment. It's kind of outweighing its usual role in the mix, and so there has been, I guess, some positive signs. There's been about 5 or 6% increase in demand. Unfortunately, for those of us on the for hire side, most all of that 5 or 6% increase in demand in the trucking market has been allocated to this kind of outsized private fleet. So
it's at least served as a headwind on that front. There's no doubt.
Transitioning, into the demand thing, we've been speaking a lot about supply. Let's kind of transition into some of the good news, I guess. You want to talk a little bit about what we got for the remainder of 2024 and what they expect?
I'd say, the one-liner is we currently have pretty healthy conditions going into 2025 and wrapping up this year and going into the even Q4 of this year and the holiday season. I mean, 2024 we saw volume growth, on average across the country for domestic freight, but it just wasn't enough to outpace the supply glut and help give a lift to the rates. It did help put the bottom end, for the last, call it 10 months or so, 8 months or so. It feels like that seems like roughly around kind of the definitive bottom at this point, looking backwards from the spot market data that, we've kind of sat in this extended trough for, call it, 8, 10 months or so. And in light of volume growth. And I think that just kind of really, I think, pulls the story together is that, well, how is volume growing and rates are not going up in light of what's happening in the for-hire market, where you are seeing exits, maybe not as rapidly as some expected, given some of the operating expense reductions and efficiencies that they've been forced to kind of focus on, the financing and paying down that we mentioned. But, I think this is, at the end of the day, a very healthy point to be in from a demand front. And I think, when you also think about Fed decisions that are looming on the horizon, I think that, any kind of rate cuts are only going to help support demand particularly in 2025 and 2026. So I'd say overall, we're not facing this very doom and gloom bleak picture, at least in what's happening on the demand side.
Yeah, certainly. And if you happen to be a driver out there, an owner op listening to us, it sounds like help is on the way. I know you've been hearing that a lot lately, but certainly from what we learned, I think all the, as you said, fundamentals and macroeconomic headwinds are pointing in that favor. So let's shift kind of on the demand front, get in specifics. There was a great panel discussion with two of the gentlemen from J.B. Hunt that's active on the container side of J.B. Hunt's business, and there was a good panel discussion starting to talk about the shifting of the ocean-going arrivals, imports coming in. That has been out heavily tilted towards the East Coast ports. That's starting to shift back to the Southern California, Long Beach, and Los Angeles ports.
They're saying now back to basically COVID levels of ocean traffic into LA, and I think we all can remember the snapshots that we saw on TV and on on the headlines of all the container ships just kind of stranded out off the coast, waiting for their turn in line to come and unload in Long Beach and in the LA ports. But I thought that was pretty insightful, because we've been going through this transition of port traffic from the West Coast to the East Coast and Southeast ports during that time, and you saw a lot of growth in these ports and infrastructure development in these ports, and here we are again, another fluctuation in the volume. And this also, is in the backdrop. You've had droughts that have led to the Panama Canal, facing severe shortages and being able to, what their throughput can be. A lot of the larger ships haven't been able to navigate through the Panama Canal. You got the Houthi rebels,
disruption over in the Red Sea,
severe disruption in the Red Sea, and some of the large players like Maersk and others just completely avoided their traditional routes to the East Coast through the Red Sea. So it's been a very dramatic, I think 2 or 3 years probably at least 3 years now on the ocean front. But now this, again, another disruption coming with this volume moving, in a pretty severe way back to the West Coast. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I think, and you had a conversation with the JB Hunt guy. They had a project down there that I actually thought was pretty interesting. Can you tell us?
Yeah, so it was pretty interesting hearing they have partnered with BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, of course, one of the largest top, I believe, 3 rail companies in the North America, and they had partnered on a new transloading facility for the containers out 100 miles inland in Barstow, California. They 4,500 acres. The plan is to greatly alleviate both emissions emanating from all of the truck traffic in the congested Long Beach and Los Angeles ports, also freeing up a lot of the logjam and delays in both the offloading process and the transloading from essentially ship to rail or ship to truck, drayage trucks. And apparently there's a lot of that has now since been tied up. It sounded like it was moving right along and going to come to fruition sooner rather than later. However, as tends to be sometimes when you're also dealing with state and local governments, a new demand was put on in the middle, or a new strong request was put on in the middle of the project that those be electric locomotives transporting from the port to the new facility 100 miles inland, which was not part of the original model. And so that has thrown a kit in the caboose, I guess.
Yeah, and according to JB Hunt, it was going to dramatically increase the cost structure associated with this project, and the emission benefits gained from those electric locomotives was an insignificant fraction compared to the gains that would come from being able to move all that volume intermodally, on top of the efficiency and congestion relief, which I'm sure the motorists in Los Angeles would also appreciate, their local residents there, of having a initiative like this just to alleviate some of that traffic. So, I mean, it was interesting. It sounds like, there may still be some opportunities for them to work through that, but it was a very unique project. One that it's probably the first of its kind that we've heard of.
That was the first I've heard of. And one thing interesting too, going back to some of what the increase in the port traffic, here we go again, back to Los Angeles and Long Beach, that, how that translated, certainly with our sales team and the customers that we serve, that could, in the relative near term, reduce capacity on the for-hire freight market, in that, the vast majority of those goods are coming to the east of the Mississippi, therefore, and a lot of those are going on trucks. And so trucks that are in the market right now may be shifting out to take loads out of Southern California back to the East Coast, which is a 4 or 5 day transit. Those are trucks that normally would be potentially looking for loads 3 or 4 of those days. They're no longer going to be in the spot side. So that could be interesting to keep an eye on of how that affects as the port traffic grows and the demand for trucks out on the West Coast grows, what that does for the load to truck ratios in some of those markets and the overall.
The one other headwind I think to call out for this circumstance in terms of trucking capacity out in California is, another sort of emissions and kind of sustainability initiative, but directed by the state of California is Carb True. And that's one thing we've already felt some very minor impacts from the requirement of basically truck traffic inbound and outbound from California being carb compliant. There's a lot of fleets that have traditionally maybe even run that East Coast and West Coast loop, and now those fleets are looking for alternatives to avoid really that one state specific regulation requirements. This is projected to have a very significant impact on California. So I think this is one thing to really keep an eye on. And I think is also just, I guess, good for all of our listeners just to understand that While you do have the FMCSA and regulatory bodies at the federal level, there can be some pretty outsized impacts from state-led initiatives that you're not necessarily dealing with kind of one flavor of trucking. You might be dealing with 50 flavors of trucking.
And there was, quite a bit of unease at the conference, I'd say, with these various hodgepodge of some of those regulations, whether California, New York, Massachusetts, some of the other areas on the Eastern Seaboard, and how a lot of these owner-operators and family fleets, we'll call them, are going to be able to adjust and if they'll be able to work their models of serving some of those states. So that was a good segue, Brett, into one of the more interesting parts, I thought, we both heard from Navistar. Why don't you, going into sustainability, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you learned on the electric vehicle front?
So I don't think it would be a trucking equipment and manufacturer conference without talking about electric vehicles, and the alternative fuel sources. So there was an executive with Navistar that was talking about their EV strategy. And I think the one thing that really stood out is just, how are we going to power these trucks and the power requirements for these electronic vehicles? We've had, this infrastructure that's developed over, well over a century for, oil and gas utilization and the combustible engine, all of that, that doesn't necessarily exist yet for the EV market. And just to kind of put some numbers and statistics around this, the current Navistar EV truck unit that's being produced that runs off of a pure play battery, 30 trucks will consume the same amount of electricity as the Empire State Building each day.
Wow.
A 300 truck fleet would consume more power than your typical small American town. And I think, where is that power going to come from is one question. And the other is the charging infrastructure. And I think you see a lot of articles and information out there just from how many consumer vehicles are out there with EVs and the limitations on routings that they can take. Translating that to the trucking world is that many of the truck routes that are utilized today to move goods around our country, for an EV perspective, they do not exist yet. There are many routes that are not feasible truck routes. It may require routing very creatively, meaning with many, many more miles involved, more days of transit involved to ultimately reach all of these destinations. And that this charging infrastructure is, what really kind of seems to be essentially decades away from being at the levels that are needed to support truck traffic as we know it today and truck routings as we know it today. Now, things can change and innovation can pave the way, and there certainly is an area that's ripe for disruption given all the investments that are going into the EV landscape. But I just think the infrastructure and that power requirement for their trucks in particular was really kind of remarkable, just to kind of see the comparison to something we could maybe relate to.
Is it fair to say that we both are on the same page in that we don't foresee electric vehicles having a meaningful, substantial impact on the trucking market in the foreseeable future?
I think, at least from the long haul perspective, it is so far off from really gaining a tremendous amount of market share within that segment. There may be more local applications that make sense, and that's, I've mentioned this as a way to kind of bridge the gap from what we know from consumer vehicles. If you are on your daily commute and then driving home and charging your car in your garage at night, that's a pretty feasible application. So, same for the trucking fleets. If you leave home base with a full battery and you return that night and your route kind of stays within the constraints of your battery's charge life for the day, then maybe that is a valid strategy. Maybe that is something that could work. But if you're talking about 2,000-mile long hauls across the country, the infrastructure is not there to put it on par with combustible engines today. And reality is that it's most likely not going to be this decade.
So potentially some final mile applications.
I think that's probably where you see the most kind of feasible applications. is just being able to live within the lifespan of the battery for that route and getting back to a charging station. I could see that, but at the same time, these trucks are pricing anywhere from 30 to 50% more than their combustible engine counterparts. So you've got a lot of very expensive decisions on the horizon for those who are wanting to pursue electric vehicles. And it's certainly not without risk. You have to essentially bank on one, that you're going to get the expected usage out of that truck when you're making that decision, but also that for some, maybe banking on infrastructure to be developed at a rapid pace to help drive some of that utilization and drive more use cases for them, like a medium haul, long haul. So it's going to be a very interesting thing to monitor as emissions come into the forefront.
So you'll have to just stay tuned on your Hit the Brakes podcast.
I think that's a great wrap up. And Louis, thanks for joining us today. And
thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us on Hit the Brakes. Visit fetchfreight.com to read more about the ACT Research Conference, and also catch our recent interview with Tim DeNoyer, Vice President and Senior Analyst of ACT Research. Our goal at Fetch Freight is to support our customers the best way possible, and we'd love to serve you. Check out fetchfreight.com to connect with someone from our team today.